my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation by a very special guest, McGill. I am not going to do the introduction, I am going to do the introduction to the introduction. My name is Paul Yack, and I'm a Shakespeare professor here at McGill. I'm the director of the Institute for the Public Life of Arts and Ideas. The executive director, Lee Yetter, is right here. And I'm director of the project called Early Modern Conversions, Religions, Cultures, Cognitive Ecologies. This is a project that's just gotten started, and it features the work of 29 faculty members from Canada, the USA, England, and France, and Australia, and New Zealand. And students, we're about 40 graduate students working now on the project from the same countries. So we've got off to a very good start. Our task is to understand forms of radical transformation in the early modern period in Europe and its worlds. There's been a great deal of excellent work on religious conversion over the past 40 or 50 years. That's not our subject. For us, religious conversion is one form of conversion in a complex network of intersecting forms of radical transformation. As I was saying to our guest, at present, at the start of our 5-year term, it's a loose, baggy monster of a project. Very exciting, but it will get trimmer and sharper as it goes on, and richer also. Thanks also to the 18 partner organizations that we're working with, 14 of which are leading institutions and libraries in various countries devoted to the early modern period, and 4 artistic organizations, including the Baroque Festival here in Montreal and the Stratford Festival in Stratford, Ontario. It is my pleasure to introduce the introducer. One of the great pleasures of this project is that it gives us the resources to recruit extraordinarily young scholars as postdoctoral fellows. Jose Juan Lopez Portillo is one of our 2 postdocs in the Conversions project. He wrote his PhD at the University of London under the supervision of our very special guest. And the thesis title is Another Jerusalem, Political Legitimacy and Courtly Government in the Kingdom of New Spain. Jose Juan's first book, an edited book, is called Spain and the Atlantic Frontier of Medieval Europe. He has much more work on the go. It's a pleasure to introduce Jose Juan.
Thank you very much, Paul, and I will continue this vein of introductions. I am delighted to be able to introduce Felipe Fernández-Armesto, who is the William P. Reynolds Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame, to both our iPlay and our McGill communities. And I'm extremely grateful that he has braved Atlantic storms and cancelled all sorts of engagements in New York to speak to us today. It's also, I should add, somewhat of a personal triumph, because the last time I tried to entice Professor Fernández-Armesto to talk was for him to come and give a lecture at my school when I was 16, but unfortunately he couldn't make it that time, so a long ambition has come true. Between then and now, however, I was lucky enough, as Paul said, to get to know Felipe first at Oxford, and then when he agreed to supervise my PhD in London, in the US. And I've always particularly admired Felipe's inquisitiveness and generosity. Not many supervisors, first of all, encourage their charges in their disagreements with them, and even fewer, I suppose, then proclaim that they've become convinced by this rebellion in the national press, which Felipe did for me, it was incredibly touching. But you don't have to take my word for any of these qualities, because a quick look at the range of subjects that Felipe has tackled in his publications, and what is more, the avenues for research that he has opened up by the intriguing new questions he has posed, are an obvious indication from his earlier work on the origins of early modern Iberian expansion to global environmental history, to histories of truth, ideas, food, and his latest publication out this year and entitled Our America, a Hispanic History of the United States, which has both titillated and discomfited former US Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano in a review in the Wall Street Journal, which you can find online. So, without further ado, I think I will hand the rostrum over to Felipe.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Juan. A very kind introduction. You managed to make me sound both nice and interesting, neither of which my wife or children would have believed possible. And thank you very much, Paul. I mean, it's such a treat to be here. I'm so lucky to have been asked to McGill, university I've always admired from afar, and now I've seen its grandeur and monumentality for myself. It's very gratifying to be your guest. I did wonder why you'd asked me, and now I know it's because the iPlay Conversions project is a big baggy monster, and so am I. But I think that will be the the limit of the commensurability from guests today, because I'm terribly worried that what I've got to say to you is completely irrelevant, probably not only to the iPlay project, but to everything else. I thought that the project was about conversion. And of course, in my predictable and boring way, I assumed this meant religious conversion. A few years ago, I did write an article about it, a rather skeptical article about conversion myths. And I thought that must be what you wanted me to talk about. Then Jose Juan said, no, it's nothing to do with religion at all, which left me puzzled about what it was to do with it. I thought to myself, really, conversion means, and I realized I was completely on the wrong lines, because I thought, surely we've got to distinguish conversion from transformation. I'm thinking, what's the difference? I now find out it's completely wrong, because Paul defines it as radical transformation. But in my own mind, I defined it as an event or a series of events in the course of which one thing becomes another without ceasing to be itself. I mean, obviously this is ontologically a rather problematic concept. I'm not surprised, that despite the uniting 29 brilliant people, you've had difficulty, as you said to me earlier, sewing up the seams of this monster. But whether you take my definition or Paul's, it's a kind of change. I really just want to say the meta-subject here is change, which of course is equally ontologically problematic. In fact, if one asks why do things change, why do we inhabit a mutable cosmos? Or at least, why isn't our world more stable? That is, why is there so much change? Why do we experience so much volatility? That's a problem which is so fundamental that it's inevitable. And yet, we never ask it. It's one of those questions which is maybe terribly hard to answer. It's terribly hard even to answer. But there was a time, in pre-Socratic Greece, when it was a hot topic and it was clearly, a matter of common debate. At the risk of oversimplifying crudely, I'd say that you can find two solutions to this problem of change in pre-Socratic texts. There's Hesiod's solution, which I think is more or less a sort of default solution that most people assume, which is that it's inexorable, that it's just part of the nature of things. It's a default system of the universe. There's no point in asking why things change. It's, the question isn't essentially different from asking why anything exists at all. But this is philosophically problematic because the very notion of change implies an antecedent state which is unchanged with respect to it. And that, I think, is why the second main explanation, the second main characterization, perhaps, of change occurs that we find in pre-Socratic texts, which is Parmenides' view that change must be illusory. Because it's so paradoxical. I mean, there's the whole notion that something can change and yet still be itself is so problematic that our experience of change must be illusory and must conceal some underlying essential stasis. And pretty much, those two solutions, the only solutions, were on the table for hundreds of years, thousands of years, with the sole exceptions of St. Augustine in the late 4th, early 5th century, and Bergson early in the 20th century, who, as far as I can see, really alone amongst philosophers, return to this very basic question of why does change happen at all? And broadly speaking, St. Augustine, again, I crudely oversimplify, but broadly speaking, St. Augustine's solution was, well, it's attributable to a force outside nature, which he called God. And Bergson's answer is that it's attributable to a force inside nature, which he called élan vital. But there's not actually an awful lot of difference between them, and neither is a terribly satisfactory solution, because they're both really invoking sort of, well, I guess in the theatrical world that Paul is part of, that you call it sort of deus ex machina. And yet, if you, I'd say that on the whole, in the last maybe 300 or 400 years, people who've asked about change have really focused on trying to explain particular kinds of change. And in my discipline, history, we're really trying to explain cultural change. I think that's how I define the role of historians. And other people have especially in the sciences, have sought to explain other kinds of change, change outside the sphere of culture, physiological, biological, and environmental changes. And the difficulty, the main difficulty that people have focused on has been how do you bring those different strands of inquiry together? What's the relationship? I suppose at a very high level in that analysis, you could say what's the relationship between biological change and cultural change. That's really what I'm going to try and focus on today. I'm going to try and say, I hope I'm going to try and say something about it that nobody has ever heard before, except me, inside my own head. I was going to start with a rather long historiographical introduction, but I haven't even started properly yet. There's already gone at 5:15. So I thought I'd cut to this image, which was really there to make a very basic and obvious point. But this kind of asking this kind of question is itself a function of the culture that surrounds us. I think on the whole, you have to be a greater genius than I to ask a question which doesn't emerge from the cultural context. And I show you this because this is the latest work of art that I could find that depicts Cleo, the muse of history. It's done by a photographer in San Francisco in 2012. And you can see that, unlike the other images of Cleo that I might have shown you had I had time, she's very beautiful, but she's not a goddess. She's a human Cleo. She's black. She's Afrocentric, and she's global. So the way we approach history is a function of culture. And the suggestions I got to make to you today are equally a function of the cultural context. And in my own mind, I mean, part of the cultural context that I see as inspiring this inquiry is really the tremendous sense that we have at the moment that we are living in a period of accelerated change, which demands that even if we can't explain change ontologically, it demands that we address the problem of why our sense that it's accelerating is so acute at the moment. It's so acute that I think it's actually collectively psychologically disturbing. Because, for example, here we're looking at an image of the Amazon rainforest burning down before our eyes. Our experience of environmental change is certainly, in the way we perceive it, more intense, more rapid, and more radically transformative, I can steal Paul's language, than any of our forebears have ever experienced, or at least have ever recorded as having experienced. I mean, this is the Arab Sea, which when I was a little boy, really was a sea. I know I'm very old. It's not that long ago, really, especially in its anatomies. It's extraordinary that in such a rapid period of time, desertification should have been so intense. I don't need to drone on about the deglaciation, or any of the other, really, I don't know, is it too much to say menacing environmental changes which are unfolding in this unprecedented way today? And I think we find this disturbing in part because although the environment is actually a kind of theatre of sudden mutations, and you have seismic events which have tremendously forceful impact on the world, you have sudden diminutions or accelerations of sunspot activity which can have a transforming effect on global climate. You have sudden microbial mutations which can unleash plagues. So these things obviously happen from time to time. Generally, we've always thought of the environment as a relatively stable part of our world, compared with the volatile mutations of culture. Those also accelerated in our day. I mean, here's the Berlin Wall falling down. After the event, a lot of, kind of political gurus came out of the woodwork and claimed they'd been seeing this coming for a long time. I mean, maybe the odd genius who could do that. But for most people, this was a really sudden and total transformation of the world we inhabited. The Cold War was, our stability when I was little. And it came to something, and a lot of people would say this is another example of the same kind, where it had catastrophically rapid transformation of the political environment. Although to me, I don't rate this event terribly highly. I think people gracefully exaggerated the importance of 9/11. In a way, what's remarkable about it is how little it changed. When you think that within a few days, people, firms whose headquarters were in the top floors of these towers were back at work. Maybe, the really transformative event was this, the Iraq War, which I certainly found devastating to my political cosmology, because I had been brought up to think that democracies are peaceful, and that it's very hard to fool people into wars if they have to vote for them. And this really, demonstrated that was a very widespread characteristic assumption of my generation was false. You could fool democracies into stupid, destructive, and evil wars just as easily as dictatorship. Or, if we look at the economic volatility of our world, this is riot that accompanied the collapse of the Argentine peso in 1990. But you know, we've experienced plenty of economic volatility, not least the global meltdown in 2008. Since then, or you know, these underlying cultural transformations, global migration is obviously a very conspicuous source of cultural change. And I show you these Italian images because they do, I think, illustrate something which could equally well be illustrated from almost every host culture of rapid migration, which is the fear that it inspires. It usually irrational fear, often generating hatred, that ensues when people feel the culture is rapidly changing and their traditional culture is threatened. I don't think global migration is responsible for the rapid transmutations of culture in our day, but those transmutations are certainly going on. Here's a very good example. These are the floral tributes which were placed outside Buckingham Palace when the former Princess of Wales, Diana Spencer, died. I was actually in the United States when this happened. My wife, England, was telephoning me every day saying, "You will not believe what was happening." And she was quite right. I mean, I couldn't believe it. Because, you know, this stuff was happening in a culture that I had been brought up in, that I think I knew. And that my father had described when he was a Spanish journalist in London, book in the 1940s, and he described, with perhaps less originality than I would wish, he described, you know, the England that everybody thought was sort of essential, an England which, you know, people had stiff upper lips and minds as tightly rolled as their umbrellas. But, you know, this event showed that had ceased to be the case. The stiff upper lip had gone wobbly. And, you know, it turned out the English were just as mawkish, sentimental, and emotionally ill-disciplined as other Europeans. And you know, obviously one can multiply these examples, and this cultural transformation, I think, is very profound, it's very extensive. Obviously owed nothing to immigrants. You know, the English have changed themselves of their own volition, perhaps, you know, unthinkingly. And I just sort of cite an example like this. This was completely unthinkable when I was little. And same as this. And I don't know, when, you know, as you know, I work for a Catholic university. When I see, especially this paper, you know, praying in a mosque, I really do feel that I am in a sort of Rip Van Winkle world. And every morning, you know, I wake up and find a cultural context which is transformed from the one in which I had gone to bed the night before. So we are looking at a very rapid and very unsettling period of cultural change. And I think because we have this consciousness of its rapidity, we're driven to see explanations. And we're driven to seek those explanations all the more urgently because of the evidence of anxiety and even fear that this kind of volatility evidently arises. We can see from the evidence of anti-immigrant irrationality. Well, my proposal for today is the solution lies here. In an event which when I was little, it was celebrated, I think, really certainly all over the former British Empire, probably, you know, very extensively in the Anglophone world, where every day in the London Zoo, for example, at 4:30, they really did have an event that they called the Chimpanzees Tea Parties, all throughout the 1950s and I think much later. And they laid out a table with tea things and pots of tea and milk and cakes and marmalade and all. And of course the result was, and those chimpanzees, you know, sat down and had their tea. And the result was chaos. You know, because they employed the sandwiches as missiles, they poured the tea everywhere, they smeared each other with the honey, and we children stood around laughing. Something which now, you know, makes me feel terribly guilty because it was an offence against the dignity of the chimpanzee. Who, according to Desmond Morris, a famous curator who was in charge of the Monkey House, who in any case were actually having their performance out for the benefit of the audience. And indeed, this was so politically incorrect that now, you know, the Tea Party is permanently cancelled. And indeed, I mean, I showed you this toy because it's very hard. I think this is a function of the political incorrectness of the chimpanzee's tea party. It's very hard to find a decent picture on the web of the tea party in progress. Now, I think that the lesson of this for me is that although we stood around walking, the joke was really on us. Because I wouldn't have put it this way when I was 5 years old. But I think the reason we laughed was that we thought chimpanzees were not cultural animals. We thought, almost everybody thought in those days, that culture was unique, a feature of Homo sapiens, and that the chimpanzees would not be able to understand the concept of food that was for more than eating. They wouldn't be able to understand the concept of a meal as a social ritual which had you know, other functions, community-forging functions, civilizing processes. But we now know that they are cultural creatures. That they do have a culture. I'm just following the common understanding of culture as behavior which is transmitted by learning across a society and through the generations. And we know that chimpanzees do have such behaviors. They even have such behaviors in connection with food, because hunting chimpanzees distribute meat amongst members of the tribe according to an approximate hierarchical order. And we would look just as silly, I think, at a chimpanzee meat distribution event as they do at a, you know, English bourgeois tea party of the 1950s. And this discovery that we are not alone, you know, that there are other cultural creatures out there, is to me the most challenging scientific discovery of my lifetime. I mean, you're far things that you can keep, you know, space travel and DNA, because when we realize that we're not uniquely cultural, that challenges our very conception of ourselves and our relationship to the rest of nature, the rest of creation. I think the two, you know, sciences that are not really two, but the sorts of terms that one might use to describe this transformative science of my lifetime, we'll say primatology, a term which I've invented, cultural zoology, which is really meant to invent the study of the cultures of all cultural animals, or at least all non-human cultural animals. These are the areas to which we should look in order to understand why culture happens at all. And that's going to be the key to understanding why it changes.